Good morning. My name is Jarvis Givens, and I'm an assistant professor here at HGSE, and I've been given 8 minutes to tell you everything you need to know about the history of education. I'm kidding, obviously. But I'll take this little bit of time to tell you a little about my research in teaching as a historian who studies the relationship between race, power, and schooling. So by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the Common School movement? Okay. Oh, well, fewer of you than I expected, but that's fine. In short, the Common School movement might be thought of as the early efforts to establish public education after the American Revolution, but which really began to take root sometime during the 1830s. So while the main script of the history of American education generally extends from this particular narrative, my research in teaching traces a story of education that formed underneath the Common School movement. In its shadows, I'm referring to the origins of African American education. So structural suppression of Black education in North America is older than the United States as a nation. For instance, after the Stono Slave Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, a legal code was passed, among other things, made it illegal for Blacks to learn to read and write. This was decades before the American Revolution. These regulations, known as anti-literacy laws, became nearly universal across the southern states by the 1850s. Given these conditions, Black education developed in covert fashion. So let's begin with the case of Richard Parker. Born enslaved in Virginia in 1806, Parker routinely carried a book on his head, concealed under a hat. This hidden curriculum was central to the education Parker pieced together through subversive methods, all of which were forbidden by custom and later by law. Virginia passed anti-literacy laws as early as 1819. This legal precedent was reinforced through subsequent acts leading up to emancipation. For instance, an act passed in April 1831 declared, quote, that all meetings of free Negroes or mulattoes at any schoolhouse, church, meeting house, or other place for teaching them reading or writing shall be deemed and considered as an unlawful assembly, end quote. The act then authorized whippings, quote, at the discretion of any justice of the peace, but not exceeding 20 lashes. Anti-literacy laws enforced the idea that Blacks were outside the social contract of American society, inconceivable as human or citizen. Enslaved people subverted this prohibition by acquiring literacy through fugitive tactics. Richard Parker represents one of many instances. For instance, Mandy Jones recalled how other enslaved people on her Mississippi plantation secretly congregated at night to climb into a pit in the ground, literally under the earth. And some Black person that, quote, had some learning would have a school, end quote. So building from these historical narratives, my current research picks apart at this phenomenon I have come to call fugitive pedagogy, which is a grounded theory I'm using to reframe and revise the meta-narrative of the history of Black education. Fugitive pedagogy refers to Black people's teaching and learning activities that explicitly challenge white supremacy, and more generally, the hidden transcripts, both literally and figuratively, of their political motivations for education. The theory underscores how these backstage performances of defiance were often disguised by public performances of deference to coercive forms of power in the American school. So in short, what I'm saying is that violent prohibition of Black education during slavery forced African Americans to pursue education in covert fashion. And furthermore, even as Blacks could legally participate in marginal educational opportunities after slavery, violent resistance would persist, and therefore, critical parts of their education continued to take place in secret. So, let me tell you a little bit about how these ideas formed and are substantiated in my research. A great deal of my time is spent searching through old records from the 19th and 20th centuries, correspondences between educators, curriculum materials developed by Black teachers, public school reports, testimonials of Black educational life, and a lot more. My job is to take these archival fragments and try to piece out the reality of how African Americans experienced structures, curricula, and policies of the American school, but also how they experimented with their own ideas about teaching and learning. So now I'd like to turn back to some of those archival fragments that capture what fugitive pedagogy looked like in the afterlife of slavery. Tessie McGee taught history during the 1933 school year. She was 28 years old, African American, and a teacher at Webster Parish Training School in Louisiana. The state's White Board of Education provided clear instructions. Teachers were to have the pre-approved outline openly displayed on their desks, from which they were to follow closely to ensure that students became well acquainted with the targeted learning objectives for history. In a steady, measured tone, Ms. McGee read to her class, but on many occasions, her lessons were not taken from the outline that could be spotted on the desk in front of her. She often made necessary revisions by reading from a textbook written by the famed Black educator and historian, Carter G. Woodson, which sat comfortably in her lap, under the desk. Ms. McGee kept the book out of immediate sight in case someone decided to peek into her classroom. One of her students recounted, quote, "She read to us from that book. When the principal would come in, she would simply lift her eyes to the outline that resided on the desk and teach us from the outline. When the principal disappeared, her eyes went back to the book in her lap," end quote. Ms. McGee's concealment of Woodson's textbook beneath the desk offers a clear marker of her fugitive pedagogy. The public exposure of the official outline was in fact a masked performance of submission to the state's white school authorities. It's worth noting that embedded in the very textbook that McGee secretly read from was the narrative of enslaved people, quote, "learning as a means of escape," end quote. Thus, fugitive pedagogy is manifested in both the curricular content and the physical pedagogical act. Critical parts of Black education had always taken place underground, under a hat, under the earth, under a desk. These are more than simply isolated acts of resistance. What we see, however, is fugitive pedagogy translated into organized efforts to acquire literacy, in the act of writing new curricular scripts, and in the very content of the curriculum itself. We also find that fugitive pedagogy was embodied in the physical pedagogical acts by Black teachers. So orbiting underneath the Common School movement and then the American public schools of the 19th and 20th centuries was a veiled Black educational world in which fugitive pedagogy was a critical part of content and form. It is my hope that these kinds of histories come to serve as a resource for those striving to be critical educators. Allowing these histories to wash over us strengthens our moral center of our professional identities as educators. They also present models of transgressive pedagogy to look to, a more continuous tradition for critical educators to see themselves as part of. So in a moment when public education in general is under assault, the work of all educators, at least it seems to me, is inherently subversive. So we might look to the origins of African American education in seeking out the deepest truths of our work in times such as these. Thank you.